The 18th century was not only a time when the colonists of British North America were developing a society distinct from their European homelands. The development of a uniquely African American culture was evolving as well. This unit will review conditions under which African slaves lived, how those conditions varied by region, and how African American culture evolved prior to the American Revolution. Life within the slave system was inhumane, but the experiences and hardships of slavery varied regionally and were largely due to the different demands of the cash crop being produced. For example, life in the Carolinas and Georgia was more severe because the labor of rice farming was not only intensive, but it also exposed slaves to environmental factors that were hazardous to their health. The hot, humid climate of the Deep South and the tepid water of rice paddies bred infectious diseases that ravaged slave populations. Furthermore, rice and indigo plantations were further removed from one another than tobacco plantations of Virginia and Maryland were. African slave populations were isolated from one another, which not only made life a lonely living hell, but prevented a sense of community among slaves in the Deep South. Life for black slaves in the Carolinas was so bleak and dangerous that populations there were not sustaining their numbers through natural increase. Instead, planters would have to rely on imports to replace their dead and dying slaves. By 1720, the proportion of female slaves in the Chesapeake region was big enough to perpetuate slave population through natural reproduction. From this point on, the number of slave imports to Virginia and Maryland from the West Indies and Africa dropped significantly. It is important to remember that slavery was not isolated to the southern colonies. Slaves in New England and the middle colonies totaled roughly 48,000 on the verge of the American Revolution. These slaves often served tradesmen in port cities or large farms along the Hudson River. As the number of native-born African Americans increased, a distinctive culture took hold throughout the colony's slave communities that was a mixture of African and American elements of speech, religion, and folkways. Language like Gullah, which were blended forms of native African languages from Angola, and English developed in the South. Some words from Gullah, like voodoo, goober, and gumbo, persist with us today. African musical traditions like the call and response and percussion driven music eventually contributed to the development of jazz, the blues, bebop, and rock. The contributions of African American slaves are not limited to plantation agriculture and culture. The infrastructure of the 18th century, roads, bridges, buildings, canals, and other public projects were chiefly produced by the manual labor of black slaves. Life under the lash did lead some slaves to rebel against their masters and make attempts to escape their bondage. In 1712, a group of 23 slaves conspired to kill their masters and run away to freedom. Their plot included lighting a building on fire and then turning on their masters with guns, swords, and axes they had left in their homes when they assisted in putting out the fire. The fugitive slaves killed 9 whites before attempting to flee. The city's militia and vigilantes rounded up 70 blacks and placed them in jail. After interrogating their suspects, the New York courts tried 27 and executed 21 African Americans believed to be responsible. 20 of the condemned were burned at the stake, and one was broken on the wheel, meaning he was tied to a wagon wheel, tortured, and beaten to death. The largest and most infamous slave rebellion of colonial history was the one that took place along the Stono River in South Carolina. In this case, harsh conditions of slavery coupled with propaganda spread by Spanish operatives encouraging slaves to run away to Florida triggered the event that would lead to 25 whites and twice as many blacks to die. 80 slaves would eventually fill the ranks of the rebellion led by a literate, imported slave from the Congo named Jemmy. Under a banner that read Liberty, Jemmy's men marched southward from one plantation to the next, taking supplies and murdering the families of white owners that would sound the alarm. The group had marched about 15 of the 150 miles it needed to go to get to Spanish Florida before it was intercepted by the militia. Within 2 days, the Stono Rebellion was crushed, and most of Jemmy's followers were executed, returned to their masters, or sold into slavery in the West Indies. While none of the 18th century slave rebellions would inflict the casualties that Nathaniel Bacon had, the consequences of their efforts would have monumental impact on the slave codes of the southern colonies. The Negro Act of 1740 prohibited slaves from growing their own food, assembling in groups, earning their own money, or learning to read. Furthermore, South Carolina placed a temporary suspension on slave imports to encourage the purchase of native-born African Americans. And it also required owners considering freeing their slaves to go through the tedious process of getting the colonial assembly's permission before doing so. This was out of the suspicion that free blacks incited enslaved ones to fight and flee. Of course, all of this enhanced the fear white society had of African Americans and perpetuated the stereotype that without slavery, blacks were instinctually violent. 5 years before the Stono Rebellion, South Carolina had passed a law requiring white men to carry arms, even to church. As a response to smaller slave uprisings, years after the Stono Rebellion, it would still be blamed for inspiring small uprisings throughout the South.